Hello, everyone. We're going to talk about the U.S. response to World War II. But before we do so, we have to review a topic we talked about a while ago, isolationism versus interventionism. So if you remember back to our conversation on American imperialism, one of the big debates and one of the big changes in American foreign policy was to be isolationist, meaning that you focus in on American ideas, you don't get involved in world affairs, versus interventionist, meaning that you do get involved in what other countries are doing. With World War I, the US was an isolationist nation. They didn't want to get involved, and they only get involved very, very late in the game. Now, when we get to World War II, we're going to see a major debate about isolationism versus interventionism, and what should we do? So I want to start off with a kind of brief history of isolationism, and that'll lead us into our conversation. So, isolationism, the idea of the US not getting involved in other countries' affairs, actually goes back to the founding fathers. In President Washington's, so our first president's farewell address, he says, quote, "The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connections as possible. So that as we have already formed engagements, let them be filled with good faith. Here let us stop. Our detached and distant situation invites and enables us to pursue a different course." So what Washington is saying is the U.S. shouldn't get involved in other countries' affairs. They can do so as long as they're trading, as long as it's in commerce, but they shouldn't get involved in any other way. And that sets the stage for a lot of U.S. foreign policy. Going back to the Monroe Doctrine, we see the idea of the U.S., we're staying out of European affairs, we're not getting involved. Europe, stay out of American affairs. When we get to 1914 in World War I, President Woodrow Wilson says, okay, we're going to not get involved in the war. And he sees himself as kind of the heir to George Washington, saying, yeah, we're not getting involved. We will trade with you, but that's it. Now, in the 1930s and the 1920s, we start to see a rise of isolationism for a couple reasons. First off, America does get involved in World War I, and that has really disastrous outcomes. So, for example, a whole generation of young men died during World War I, and Americans are like, really? Was it worth it for us to go to war? So they start responding to that. They're also responding to the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, which kills off young and old men and women across the country, and it does so without discrimination. Well, everyone blames the Spanish flu on, can you guess, the Spanish? And they say, well, if we hadn't gotten involved with World War I, why should we bother doing so? Isolation also reflected what's going on at home. So, for example, we still are in the era of Jim Crow, and people in Europe are starting to criticize the U.S. for these Jim Crow policies. And the U.S. is going, mind your own business, we're going to do what we want to do. At the same time, we're in the Great Depression, and people are saying, why should we spend money and why should we get involved with the rest of Europe or the rest of the world when people are starving and they have no place to live? So let's focus in on us. So this leads to a rise of various isolationist either organizations or laws. So for example, in 1921, we see the creation of the National Council for the Limitation of Armaments, which was a committee. And it was a nationwide committee saying, okay, we need to stay out of foreign wars. We're not getting involved in foreign wars. And that's all well and good until the mid-1930s. In the mid-1930s, Europe is starting to get ready to go to war. Hitler has come to power. He's getting ready to expand. And America knows this. America knows there will be a war in Europe. The question is when. Not if, but when will this war break out? So the government starts passing laws, and the laws are there to make sure that the U.S. will not get involved in this war that's going on in Europe. So in 1935, we have the Neutrality Act, which says the government cannot sell arms to belligerent nations, meaning you cannot give guns, you cannot give weapons to places that are at war. The next year, it says the government passes another Neutrality Act saying that the government can't give loans to nations that are at war. So, for example, if Britain is getting ready to go to war with Germany, they need money to do so, and they'll go to the U.S. saying, well, can we borrow money from you? And the government says, nope, we're not going to do that. In 1937, the Neutrality Act is actually expanded, and it starts to say not just the government cannot sell arms, cannot give loans, but individual Americans cannot do the same. So it says if you're an American and you make arms, you can't sell those to those at war. So it says that government policy now affects civilians, not just government policy. So for many people, they don't want to go to war in the 1930s. They don't want this to happen. But there are people who do want to go to war. They want interventionism. And I want to give you a brief history of interventionism. So I've talked a lot in this class about the Monroe Doctrine and how that promotes isolationism. But it actually also promotes interventionism. The Monroe Doctrine says that if a European nation interferes with any nation in the Americas, America will declare war. And that's the quote on the slide. So they basically say, don't mess with the Western Hemisphere. Well, that's still interventionism. It's not just we're not going to go to war, but if you come and you invade Mexico, or if you invade Canada, or if you invade one of the countries in Central or South America, we will go to war with you. That's interventionism, saying that we will intervene on behalf of this country. Now, as we know from our conversation on imperialism, on the whole, people tended to be very isolationist until we get to the era of imperialism, in which case the US starts to go to war and starts to intervene on behalf of other nations. So, for example, we have the Spanish-American War, which is when the US claimed Cuba. We have the Philippines, in which the US is saying, okay, well, we're going to claim the Philippines. And then we see the annexation of Hawaii, which was a sovereign nation. Now, the reason for each of these moments of imperial intervention is the Monroe Doctrine, specifically what's on the slide, that says if European powers interfere, we will go to war. So the US goes to war with Spain for Cuba because the Cubans are trying to get free of Spain. So the US says, well, you've interfered in a sovereign nation in Cuba. We're going to kick you out. We're going to protect them. And then the US claims Cuba. The acquisition of the Philippines and of Hawaii were actually the same reason. We're scared that the Spanish are going to take over, so we are now going to intervene. We're going to go over and we will claim you to protect you from European invasion. And so that leads to American imperialism. So initial imperialism, initial intervention, was a reflection of the Monroe Doctrine, even though the Monroe Doctrine is isolationist. Now, in 1904, we see the Roosevelt Corollary. And the Roosevelt Corollary changes the meaning of interventionism. It isn't just, okay, well, we're going to go out and we're going to protect you from European invasion, but now we have a new rule. It is our role to be peacekeepers. That's our goal. So we have to go around and protect the rest of the world as peacekeepers. And so the Roosevelt Corollary allows for more U.S. interventionism, even though people don't actually want it. They want to be isolationists. So when the U.S. finally joins World War I, they do so as a peacekeeping force. They're like, okay, you guys have been fighting for 3 years, we'll come in and we'll stop it. That's the idea. This idea of the U.S. being peacekeepers was outlined after World War I ends, when President Wilson says, well, let's create a League of Nations. And let's have this League of Nations work together to make sure there's no more wars. And he says the U.S. will lead it. Well, the League of Nations was actually never ratified by Congress because Congress is saying, nope, we're done. This isn't happening. It's not going to happen here. So the League of Nations fails. And the U.S. goes back to the isolationism that I discussed previously. But as war is breaking out, there's this conversation in the 1930s. Okay, there's a coming war. Hitler's a little crazy, man. And so people are saying, well, should we intervene? Roosevelt starts saying, well, let's work with our allies. And he starts talking about this. And in response to Roosevelt saying we need to help our allies, Congress passes the Neutrality Act that I talked about. But when it becomes clear how bad things are in Europe, the Neutrality Acts start figuring out a way for the U.S. to intervene. So, for example, the 1937 Neutrality Act, which, going back to this slide, says that civilians can't help in the European war effort, also has a clause that's known as the cash and carry. The cash and carry clause says that European nations at war can go to civilians, buy items from civilians, if the European powers transport these goods on their own. So it's not going to be a civilian ship going over with the arms that you might be selling, or even with the basic necessities you might be selling, such as food and clothing. And that's what cash and carry was supposed to be, just food and clothing. Instead, it needs to be the European nation coming and picking up these goods, buying them, picking them up, and leaving. Now, cash and carry was supposed to be initially only for basic necessities, food and clothing. But in 1939, it's expanded for armaments, for guns. So individuals can sell this. The government isn't, individuals are, so long as the European nation takes it out. So Congress is doing its best to make sure the U.S. is not involved in another war. Now, this conversation about going into another war is really epitomized by a national debate that's occurring. And this debate is between isolationism and interventionism. And the two people who kind of lead it are Charles Lindbergh and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I'm going to give you the briefest of overviews of this debate. If you're interested, there's this great book that came out pretty recently called America First that goes over the debate in much more detail. Okay, so for the side of isolationism, we have Charles Lindbergh. Charles Lindbergh is best known for being the first man to fly across the Atlantic. So he's an American who flies across the Atlantic, and he becomes very, very popular in Europe. In the 1920s, he ends up actually going to live in Europe. His one child had been kidnapped and brutally murdered, and there's this massive press, like the press become obsessed, and he and his wife are stalked. They don't feel safe, and they're like, we're leaving the U.S., we're going to live in Europe. So in Europe, Lindbergh sees what's going on in Germany. He knows what's happening. He ends up even taking kind of like this tour of Germany to see what are their armaments. And Lindbergh at first is like, I'm not that impressed. He's looking a lot at the airplanes that are being developed. He's like, America's doing better. He's not that impressed. But Lindbergh truly, truly believes in isolationism. And he doesn't want the U.S. getting involved. He's like, the French can go to war with the Germans. The British can go to war with the Germans. But the U.S. shouldn't be involved. And so he becomes a member of the America First Committee. The America First Committee only existed for about a year, and it was a committee that was there to make sure that the U.S. does not get involved with World War I. Now, when Lindbergh joins the America First Committee, people are super excited because Lindbergh has a personality cult. He's saying we have a common enemy, the Germans, but also the government. And he's saying the only way, and he's saying, I have a solution for making our lives better. And his solution is not getting involved. So people start saying, Lindbergh, you should be a politician. And Lindbergh's like, no, I'm not going to do that. But he says, I will go around and talk about why we should be an isolationist nation. One of his most famous speeches stated, quote, the time has come when those of us who believe in an independent American destiny must band together and organize for strength. We have been led towards war by a minority of people. This minority has power, it has influence, it has a loud voice, but it does not represent the American people. So he's saying that only a couple people want to go to war. In order to make sure that doesn't happen, the American people need to come together. Now, Lindbergh was a really powerful speaker, and I want you to just get a hint of this, because remember, personality cults rely upon technology. So we have radio, but we also have the beginning of newsreels. So you go to the movies and you'll see a newsreel. So you can actually watch Lindbergh live. Well, not live. You can watch him talking, is a better way to put it. You can watch a movie, you can watch his expression. And that helps develop his personality cult as a leader. I will post the link to Lindbergh's speech because when I tried to record it just now, it didn't work. Of course it didn't. But I want you to just, after you've gone through this video, take a moment to watch Lindbergh and to watch Roosevelt and watch their speeches, because this being able to listen to someone on the radio or watch a newsreel at the movies really revolves in their personality goals. So Lindbergh becomes the number one person to go around and to say we should not get involved in this war. He says, quote, "We have weakened ourselves for many months, and still worse, we have divided our nation by dabbling in Europe's wars. While we should have been concentrating on American defense, we have been forced to argue over foreign quarrels. We must turn our eyes and our faith back to our own country before it is too late. And when we do this, a different vista opens before us." So his argument is focus on us. Do not go to war. And people listen to Lindbergh. I would argue that about 75% of the population agrees with Lindbergh. They're like, we don't want to get involved with this. Now, leading the charge for the interventionist is President Roosevelt. So remember, he has a personality cult. He's brilliant at using the radio, and now he starts to use newsreels. Now, Roosevelt starts to say we should go to war. We should get involved with this. And his argument reflects a lot of what was going on in the Roosevelt corollary. So this isn't this Roosevelt in the Roosevelt corollary. This is his cousin, Teddy Roosevelt. So in arguing that the U.S. should get involved, Roosevelt says, quote, "There are many among us who in the past closed their eyes to events abroad because they believed in utter good faith what some of their fellow Americans told them. What was taking place in Europe was none of our business. What no matter happened over there, the United States would always pursue its peaceful and unique course in the world." So he's saying, y'all have been lied to. We can't stay out of this. We can't. It's going to affect us somehow. We're being lied to or being fed misinformation. He then argues that, quote, "We must be the great arsenal of democracy." So this is going back to the Roosevelt corollary, American peacekeepers. So Roosevelt goes forward and he starts to say we need to go to war. He says this is unprecedented. At no previous time has American security been as seriously threatened from without as it is today. Every realist knows that the democratic way of life at this moment is being directly assaulted in every part of the world. He says we look towards a world founded upon 4 essential freedoms. He's going to the Roosevelt corollary and saying it is our duty to protect democracy. So Roosevelt proposes a new way of looking at interventionism, 4 essential freedoms. And I will post the link so that you can watch it. But according to this, the 4 freedoms are, the first is the freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. The second freedom is of every person to worship God in his own way, every way in the world. The third is freedom from want, which is translated into world terms, means economic understandings which will secure every nation a healthy peacetime life for its inhabitants, everywhere in the world. Fourth is freedom from fear, through which no nation will be in a position to commit an act of physical aggression against any neighbor, anywhere in the world. So Roosevelt is building upon the Roosevelt corollary. He's saying we're not just peacekeepers, we are bringing these fundamental freedoms. Now the first 2 freedoms should sound familiar. They're from the Bill of Rights. Moreover, the second freedom is kind of important because we were talking about the rise of the KKK and how they want to create a Christian nation. Well, Roosevelt is actually building upon that to say this should be a Christian nation. Worship God in his own way, not the divine, which could be any number of gods, but God, the Christian. In the next ideas, though, Roosevelt is expanding. He's going past the Bill of Rights. He's saying you should have freedom from want, from poverty, which goes back to his role in expanding the government for the CCC and the WPA, all under the New Deal. He's also saying you should live in a world of peace. Like you shouldn't be worried that your neighbor's going to invade you. And so he starts to say, okay, there's a reason for us to go out. But in the midst of all this, as Roosevelt and Lindbergh are fighting over this, something happens in December 1941. On December 7th, 1941, the Japanese invade. Well, we've been invaded. The question of isolationism is a moot point now. We are invaded. We must go to war. We have been attacked. Now, there's evidence to suggest that Roosevelt knew about the Japanese attack and he let it happen because he wanted us to go to war. He's going to use this as a reason for interventionism. So the U.S. is drawn into the war because we are physically attacked. and the idea of interventionism versus isolationism goes away completely. The America First Committee is going to disappear because they're like, yeah, we've gone to war, we can't justify it. We've been attacked, we can't justify isolationism anymore. Lindbergh will end up working with the government to make sure that the planes, which will become the Air Force, are ready and to go, and they're top notch in order for fighting. Now, this moment in which the US has entered the war starts a period of US interventionism. The US doesn't, until very recently, talk a lot about isolationism after World War II. The idea of interventionism, particularly Roosevelt's War Truth, become part of US foreign policy through the Cold War and beyond. Let me know if you have any questions.